So this is the second lecture, and I'm going to give you sort of the highlights of what's important about these North Pacific marine heat waves. And then I want to spend some time discussing how we can, a theoretical model of how to understand the impacts of this climate variability and these climate extremes on marine ecosystem, which I like very much, and you may not have been exposed to. So maybe it's an interesting element. So as you may know, in the North Pacific, there were these big sort of warm blob or droughts and the Godzilla El Nino. All of this happened in the period between 2013 and 2016, and that sort of opened the door to sort of a lot of media, a lot of publicity, and so there were cartoons like these that described, the warm blob, the drought, the El Nino. And what was really interesting about the worm blob that we can take as a case study is that it lasted for 2 years. And that's really unusual. It's like the longest and actually strongest, one of the strongest marine heat wave that we have seen in the ocean. With that said, however, this marine heat wave in the North Pacific has not been a single occurrence. And actually, since in the last 10 years, if you actually make a map of the interannual sea surface temperature anomalies, which is shown here, you actually see that there's a lot of almost like a consistent and permanent warming phase. And one could say, well, this could be the climate trend, but it's actually not just the climate trend. And if you actually make a time series of the sea surface temperatures in this region, without removing the trends, this is what it looks like. There's a lot of low frequency variability, but you see that these last 10 years, there's been a lot of these warm events. This was the warm blob of 2014-15, but there's been more in 2019, 2021. And so this is an interesting thing, and connected with this sort of warm anomalies, this is the sea level pressure anomalies in the North Pacific. And you see that the Aleutian low here is actually reversed almost in sign. You have like a positive anomaly over much of the Northeast Pacific in this region. But anyway, if we take the blob as a case study, what was really sort of impactful about this was the size and duration. So when it was first sort of declared, it was back in the winter of 2014. And this is a sea surface temperature anomaly map with anomalies reaching over 3 degrees C in the center. And if you look at the size of this blob of warm water as it was defined, it's actually almost as big as the United States. You could see it here from the map. So it actually was a pretty big anomaly. And what happened is that the following year, in 2015, this warm water was found all along the coast. And here's where initially people felt, oh, probably maybe the advection of the currents brought the warm water on the shore, and spread along the coast. But actually, it turns out that it wasn't advection that did that, but actually, it's really the atmosphere and these teleconnections that I've been talking about that were important in persevering, essentially moving this warm blob on the coast. Because in fact, between the winter of 2014 and the following winter of 2015, some of the anomalies of the warm blob had decreased and then picked up again. And so what I was going to sort of impress upon you, and I'm going to do this easy, is that these two patterns of the blob are actually dynamically linked. And really, they follow those teleconnection dynamics that we discussed in the earlier part. In fact, if you look at these patterns of the winter 2014 and winter 2015, and you compare with the NPGO and PDO-like patterns, I'm just going to flip back and forth. You can see that they look very similar. They're not identical, but they look very similar. And that's sort of a guide of basically the fact that probably these teleconnections were important. And the teleconnections that we're talking about are basically the ones that we discussed earlier. So I'm just going to summarize them. But the idea was that in the winter of 2014, there was a strong sort of atmospheric driver. The people call it the atmospheric ridge, the persistent or resilient atmospheric ridge that was actually drove this initial SST anomaly. And then, through the usual coupling that we discussed before, like the meridional modes and stuff, there was some ENSO excitation already in the summer of 2014 with the ENSO teleconnections. And essentially, this teleconnection dynamics to and from the tropics played an important role in maintaining the blob. And this is all documented in a paper that Nate Monto and I wrote in 2016 in Nature Climate Change. And of course, I am saying the result of the paper, but in the paper, we go through length to show what was the potential impact of these teleconnections, right? Because you have to prove that. You cannot just say, oh, these teleconnections exist, therefore. No. So in that paper, we do climate model, we do some modeling experiments, some quantification to really show that this phenomena played a role, in addition to the fact that there was also some strong atmospheric variability in the Pacific. So this is really the story of the worm blob. And around that story, there are many other papers that have looked at this problem. And so, for example, in 2017, Youngji Zhou actually looked at the correlation between the SST anomalies in a winter like the NPGO-like and the following winter in PDO-like, and found that this coupling that you see here has actually been intensifying with climate change. And there's a physical reason for that. And the physical reason for that, which was discussed in a different paper, is that these meridional modes that act as a teleconnection part here are actually dependent on the mean state of the sea surface temperature. So in a warmer climate, these meridional modes become more energetic. And as they become more energetic, they have a larger ability to bring those SST anomalies and have a strong kick on El Nino. And so that was one of the sort of suggestion hypotheses of why this link is becoming stronger. And this link between the winter, one winter and the following winter is important because that is what maintains the duration of these heat waves. And in fact, Tong Tong did some studies together with a group of high schoolers where she evaluated using this empirical dynamical model, how important is this teleconnection in essentially the duration and intensity of these marine heat waves that evolve in this way. And this evolution is not just something that happened in 2014-15. It's happened before, but with less intensity. And so in this paper and in other papers that I'm not citing here, what Tong Tong did is she sort of constructed what's called the marine heat wave intensity duration frequency plot. And so if you can focus on this plot here for the observations, what this plot has on the x-axis is the duration of a marine heat wave. On the y-axis is the intensity in units of standard deviation. And then the color shade is how many heat waves you have per decade. And so you can see that there's a whole spectrum of number of heat waves per decade with different duration and intensity. So if you look, for example, at a point, it says that, you know, here in this orange area, with a duration of 6 months and intensity of 0.6 here, there are, you know, on average, you know, 2 point something events per decade, right? That's the way that you read it. And so this, we call this IDF plot, intensity, duration, frequency, gives us sort of on an X-ray of the duration frequency of these heat waves in the North Pacific. This is for the North Pacific. Here on this side is the same graph, but this graph was built using this empirical model, this linear inverse model. And the point of showing this graph is to show that this linear inverse model can capture the statistics of the observed quite well. So then what you can do next is you can say, what happens if you uncouple the tropics and the extratropics? So basically you break that teleconnection dynamics. And down here is the IDF plot of the uncoupled system. And down here is the difference between the coupled and the uncoupled. And what you see in the difference between these two is that when you uncouple the system, basically all these longer duration marine heat waves essentially disappear. So this means that without the coupling, basically you lose this portion of long-lasting marine heat waves. However, what you gain is you have stronger heat wave that lasts for less. So there's a trade-off, meaning that you lose on the duration of the heat waves, but the intensity of some of the other ones becomes stronger, which seem to suggest that these El Nino teleconnections have almost two effects. One effect is they can prolong the duration of the heat wave, but on the other hand, they also act as a source of noise to decrease the intensity. So they also have a mitigating effect. So this is an interesting result, and part of it is published in this paper by Tong Su, and part of it is actually been submitted just now with a set of high schoolers that actually use the empirical dynamical model, through this last year to do this analysis. And so that's one of the results. Some other interesting things, of course, that I want to discuss now is the fact that these heat waves had a whole bunch of socio-ecological impacts, and these were wide range in this area, and maybe they have been discussed earlier during this school here. But there were like shift in species distribution, salmon decline, widespread algae, humble algal blooms events, and also, of course, mammal and birds die-off. What I'd like to do, though, is I would like to evaluate a little bit how these sort of climate extremes, how to think about how these climate extreme and in general, how this decadal variability is really influencing marine ecosystem. And I want to present some work that I'm very proud of. And so I will start by trying to develop with you a general low order model of how marine populations respond to climate forcing in the coast. And this low order model is the same model that I presented this earlier today, or my morning, your afternoon, or your morning. And so the idea here is we're going to try to simulate the response, in this case, of this lower trophic chain, so the krill, the zooplankton, which is a foundational species for the food web in the ocean. And we're going to see how climate signals actually get into population like krill and zooplankton, at least from a theoretical standpoint. And we are going to use, again, the same index of krill that we used earlier this morning when I was developing the empirical dynamical model. But we're going to do it in a different way that is less mathematical, and hopefully it will produce more understanding. And so this krill species lives basically in the California current and is really very close to the region of high amplitude of the Pacific decadal oscillation pattern. So this is the SST anomaly, for example, in the winter of 2015, during the marine heat wave. And this is what the time series looks like, okay? So that looks pretty good, a very low frequency. As you can see, it doesn't have that high frequency variability. It doesn't have a peak during, extreme events like we see in the temperatures. And if you compare this blue index of the abundance of this krill with an index of the average temperature in the California current, or actually in this case, it's a Pacific decadal oscillation index, you find that there is a correlation between these two, but that correlation is 0.41, and it's barely significant. And most importantly, what you see is that the oceanic index, this PDO index, is very high frequency, whether this biological index has more of a kind of smooth version of that. And so, of course, you can smooth the PDO index, as much as you want, but that's not the point. So what we're going to do now is we're going to think about how a system responds to perturbation, and we're going to use that simple empirical model, but we're going to introduce it in a different way. And the way I'd like to introduce it is I'm going to stop sharing for a second so you can see me. And can you guys see me? Yeah. So imagine for a second that that I am a human, and somebody is driving on my street while I'm walking, and they hit me. Okay, so I get hit by someone maybe on my shoulder, and that person that hit me is sort of a hit and run kind of person, and so he hits me and just disappears and doesn't even remember that he hits me. He just has no memory whatsoever. So I got hit, and once I get hit, of course, I'm going to be in pain. And the question is, how long will I be in pain? Well, depend, of course, how bad is the hit, but for sure I will be in pain for a few days on my shoulder. And suppose that I'm walking home with this pain that is going to last for a few days, and this crazy guy maybe forgot to buy something at the store and drives back and hits me again. And so at this point now, my pain is going to increase. And the reason my pain increases is because I was already in pain. And so if they hit me again, my pain increases more. Now, the guy, again, is a hit and run, he doesn't even recall that he hit me, but I'm in pain. And the reason why I'm in pain is because I have this physiological memory of my body that allows me to remember that I'm already in pain. I mean, I can feel the pain from before. And so that memory allows me, in a way, to integrate or cumulatively add up all those sort of hits that I get from the crazy guy. So you can think of the crazy guy as being in the atmosphere, sort of random, moving around without any memory, and me being in the ocean with some memory. In this case, my shoulder, my physiological memory. I should say, just to add complexity, that of course I have a different memory, which is my psychological memory, because I will remember and be scared for quite a while of going out and being hit again. And that memory could last for years, right? And so you can see how a system like myself, like a human, can have multiple levels of memory. And those multiple levels of memories will accumulate and integrate these drivers, these random forcing, like the guy driving around, for a very long time. Okay, so obviously my physiological pain will not last forever, and maybe it will last for maybe 3 days. And so that means that after 3 days, my pain will go back to zero. And so this very simple model is essentially a conceptualization of that empirical dynamical model that I showed you earlier. And we're going to use this simple model to model, our ecosystems. And so I'm going to go back here. And what I'm going to do now, this is basically the empirical dynamical model that I told you. So this is me, R. My rate of change of pain is equal to the guy who's hitting me, and then it will go away within a certain time scale, which is the time scale of decay. Okay, so that's basically the simple model that we showed this morning. And so we're going to apply this, to the Aleutian low. So what we're going to do is we're going to instrument the North Pacific with a whole bunch of weather stations. Okay. And these weather stations represent basically the weather at each of these stations. And this weather is completely random. And so I'm going to simulate the weather now. And the way I'm going to simulate these dots, what they show here is essentially the size of the dot is how strong the weather. And then the fact that they're going up and down means that that's time. Okay, and so they move very fast, big, small, etc. So that's a random weather in the North Atlantic that I'm simulating just for fun. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to add an ocean, and this ocean is basically going to have the memory like I have, like the one that I described. So it's going to integrate these weather station data at each location. And of course, the memory that I'm going to put in the ocean is going to be about 7 months or 6 months in this case, which is the memory of the sea surface temperatures in the North Pacific. And so now I'm going to instrument again the ocean with these blue water stations, and I'm going to run my model. And here we go. And so as we run the model, you see that the atmosphere, the balls are going back and forth, high, low, and the ocean is responding. But the dots in the ocean, you can see, are moving slower, right? And they're moving slower because they have memory. So once they're hit there, they tend to be in the same spot. They don't just go back to zero. And so this memory, really what it's doing, it's adding what we discussed before, this low frequency variability. Things are moving slower because of this memory, okay? So basically that's that. And what we're going to do now is we're going to think that if you are a marine species that lives in the ocean, you're very likely impacted by changes in the ocean condition, not directly the atmosphere. And so we can apply the same model now to the ecology, to a marine species, and say, okay, if you're in the ocean and the ocean is driving around, how do you respond? And so the question now is, if we think of the krill, one could say, well, what is the memory of the krill? That's really hard to just say, but we could just do some ballpark estimates. For example, these krill species can live anywhere between 1 and 3 years. So in principle, you could say that the memory of the krill to a perturbation is about the lifespan that they have. That's the longest memory, so maybe 2 years. But the issue, of course, is that these krills, we cannot think of the memory as the memory of the individual, but we really have to think about the memory of the group. But for the purpose of this exercise, we're going to say that the memory of the krill is about 2 years. Okay, or even 1 year. It doesn't really make a big difference. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to instrument our ocean with all these stations of zooplankton. and we're going to essentially apply the same model, but now the krill here is driven by the ocean instead of directly from the atmosphere. And so let's run this. And as you watch this movie, what I want you to appreciate is how slow the red dots are growing and decaying. And so what's happening here is that by going through this sort of double integration, one integration as the ocean is integrating this driver of the atmosphere, and a second integration when the ecosystem is essentially being driven by the ocean, produces a very slow moving response in the ecosystem. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to plot a time series of this fake model at the first station to just show you what these time series look in time. And this is what they look like. So here in the atmosphere, you have this very high frequency variability. In the ocean, that high frequency content of the variability is starting to be more smooth and you have more low frequency. But when it gets down to the ecosystem, you basically have almost no high frequency variability left. It's been smoothed around. Now, if you look at this particular time series, you have to realize that this is just noise. So this trend that exists here from, for example, from what is it, from 1980 to the 2000 is actually just noise. It's not a real trend. And this is important because a lot of the species in the ocean have this kind of low frequency memory and do show this very low frequency behavior. And so one could think about this low frequency behavior as being just this process of integrating, the atmosphere, the ocean, and then into the ecosystem. And what's important here is that if you look at this trend here, most of our ecosystem data that we had, at least until a while ago, were about 20 to 30 year long. And so if you saw a trend like this, you would say, hey, climate change. But is it really climate change? In this case, this would suggest that this is just random noise, and this is just part of the natural variability of these particular species. So the question, of course, was, does this model work in nature? And so what we did here is we tried this model for our krill in the North Atlantic, and so in the North Pacific. So we made an index of the Aleutian low, which I already described before, so I'm not going to go in there. So this is what it looks like. You've seen this before. And then we ran this model. So the model has only two parameters: the memory of the ocean, which in this case was, I think, 6 months, and the memory of the ecosystem, which was about 1 year, I think, for this case. And so we run this model, and this is what we get. And again, if we compare the ocean with the PDO, we get a very good correlation of 0.61. And now the question is, how about the krill? Turns out that we can reproduce the krill extremely well with the correlation of 0.84. And this particular, thing here is all basically, we have only two parameters and two assumptions: the memory of the ocean and the memory of the species. And one could say, well, how important are those assumptions? It turns out that they're not even that important. The only important thing of this model is that the ocean has a memory that is shorter than the ecosystem. That's all that matters. If you have that, you get the same result. I also should say that when we look at this model output here, you cannot get this type of comparison by simply smoothing or sort of low passing the PDO index, because it's not just the fact that it's a smooth version of the PDO, because the integration process also adds a time lag that is also important. And so this simple model, we sort of call the double integration models. And really the two integrations are from the atmosphere into the ocean, because the ocean is integrating essentially the atmospheric forcing, and then into the ecosystem. And this was published in 2013 with Mark Homan, again, entitled Double Integration Hypothesis to Explain Ecosystem Response. So what's nice about this model is that if you run this model, you can get a whole bunch of different behaviors in a simulated sort of ecosystem time series or marine species. These are just examples. And these examples actually go really well with some of the stories that you hear about people that are looking at fisheries, for example. Oh, we had a sudden collapse, then the stock was low, then it came up, there was a strong recovery. How many times have you heard of this in fisheries? The same is true here, like sudden recovery, then there was a collapse, and then it didn't recover. Those are stories that you've heard, but those stories could happen just randomly, not necessarily all induced by humans or other drivers, although of course humans and other drivers are important. So with that in mind, then, we thought, can we apply this simple integration, double integration model to fisheries? And And one of the interesting part of fisheries is if we go higher up the food chain, so we go from krill, for example, to sardine and anchovies, which are one step above. One interesting thing that was noted in sardine and anchovies was that if you looked at these time series across different oceanic basins, these time series of abundance were all characterized by extremely low frequency variability, and then something that looked like an apparent synchrony between these different data sets. And people have spent a lot of time discussing what mechanisms could be important, and et cetera, et cetera. And here I want to present an hypothesis that doesn't require any mechanism, but it only is part of the way that marine species are accumulating the environmental noise. And let's look at what this looks like. And so the question is, why sudden collapse? Why global synchrony? What we're going to do now is we're going to take this double integration model. And first, we're going to note that the fish are different, for example, from just a simple species of zooplankton, in that they live a long life, they move around. And so throughout their life, the fish are actually impacted by multiple stressors. They have multiple drivers, be it that is changes in the currents, in the productivity, in the type of prey interactions, whatever those are. And so what we're going to do here in the double integration model, we're going to assume that rather than having one environmental driver, we're going to have multiple environmental drivers. And so here are, for example, 8 environmental drivers. And for the sake of argument, we're going to say that these environmental drivers can be independent, so they're not correlated with each other, okay? However, each of those environmental variables will have a common signal, which may be associated with the low frequency fluctuations that we see on planet Earth. An example of that is the Atlantic multidecadal oscillation. If you go anywhere on planet Earth, you will find that anywhere between 5 to 10% of the atmospheric variability at any location is actually correlated with, is associated with the Atlantic multidecadal oscillation. So there's some low frequency signals in the planet that are present everywhere, but they're so small, 5, 10%, that you cannot see them. And so these time series, these black time series actually have that signal, which is shown here in red, but obviously your eye cannot perceive that. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take these time series and we are going to apply the double integration model. So each of these time series basically goes through this process. And you can see that now there's a lot of low frequency in these time series, as you would expect. But if you compute the correlation between this time series and this, those drivers are still independent. However, the fish has the ability to add up all these things. And so if we start adding up all these different drivers, you come up with what the fish ultimately is responding to. And if you look at the low frequency signal, now it's almost a perfect match. Now, of course, this doesn't happen like this in nature, but this is telling you that the ability of fish to double integrate the noise and accumulate different sources of noise basically acts as a very powerful filter of the low frequency variability of the climate system. And that is one of the reasons why when you look at climate modes like the Pacific Decadal Oscillation or the NPGO, there's this nice, useful finding that these PDO index and NPGO indices are really strongly correlated with the fish time series or other ecological indicators. The reason is that because ecological indicators can filter all this noise and basically try to synergize, synchronize to this lowest frequency climate signals. And so this is work that is still in prep, but it's basically that global marine populations tend to amplify and really align to low frequency climate signals just by the fact that they're integrating and accumulating these environmental drivers. And so what the prediction of this is that if you rise the climate variability, if the climate variability becomes stronger, then the level of synchrony between these may also become stronger and with a stronger alignment. And this is something that actually people have been observing in different papers. Like, for example, this is a paper by Black et al. In Global Biogeochemical Cycle. I guess I spelled it wrong. And this is really observed synchrony in marine and terrestrial ecosystems. And so this simple model may predict some of the emerging properties of the response to climate forcing. And I'm going to stop there. And these are some of the papers that we've contributed from our group that I sort of highlighted at some point in these lectures, and I hope you enjoyed this. And I'm going to stop right here, almost with 1 minute delay. So good job.
What we'll do again, I guess, is have people turn on, unmute your microphone if you want to ask questions. Manu will hesitate a second or so, and I will then put him back on. So are there any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. It was amazing. I loved it. I have a question for the ocean model you use. Have you also considered you use a layered ocean model? So because right now you use the ocean just as one box with one time to adjust, or one memory time. So would it make sense to then make different layers with different memory times?
Yeah, it's an interesting. I've never done that. The it would be interesting. It could be interesting to do. We have to think about what we would try to mimic, because this is a very theoretical kind of conceptual study. So it's really more theoretical. It wasn't trying to, if you were to do a layered, you're include more space, we would have to think, what we are trying to do. So one possibility is that you try to use this model to actually look at real data around the world, right? Where you have, maybe rather than having a 2D space like this, you have different locations around the world to see whether you can predict from environmental noise some level of synchrony, between these points. But to answer your question, I've never done a 2D sort of simulation of this model.
Okay, thank you.
We're good?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. Thank you for this talk. Yeah, I agree. It's great. When you mentioned the double integration model and the sensitivity of that model to the ocean memory and the ecosystem memory, you mentioned that it actually wasn't that sensitive, except in cases where the ecosystem memory, or say the organismal memory, might actually be shorter than the memory of the ocean.
Yes.
As you probably well know, there are some very boom and bust species that can have a very short lifespan. And in those cases where the memory of the organism could be very close to the memory of the ocean, what sorts of changes in the model overall do you observe?
Yeah, so let me just pull it up so I can show you. Just give me 1 second. I guess this picture is mildly, yeah, okay, I'll just answer it like this because I can't pull it up. So the first of all, if the memory of the ecosystem is lower than the memory of the ocean, which happens a lot, by the way, then obviously there's no way that the ecosystem can integrate any further, right? Because as soon as the ocean is so slow that as soon as you touch the ecosystem, it almost goes back to zero. So in that case, this model does not work. So that's really the bottom line, is that you basically are almost you cannot integrate any longer, right? Because for you to integrate, you have to say, tomorrow is today plus something from that I'm adding now. And if when it comes to adding, you are back to zero, then you're just in perfect sync with the actual oceanic forcing. And so there are species. So in this area, for example, that I showed you, I'm going to show this from the paper. We had another species that we looked at, which actually was not impacted by the changes in advection, but was really responding to upwelling. And that species is shown here. I don't know if you guys, if it's too small. Let me try to. I'm trying to put it in the center here. So this is the PDO index This is the integrated PDO index for the example that I showed you. Okay, so this A and C are the ones that I showed you. And then D here is another species, Euphasia pacifica, in the same region. And this species really responds to upwelling. So it's very fast. It doesn't really have a lot of memory. And you can see that the correlation that you get from just low passing the forcing index is the same. It's actually better than doing the double integration. So yes, there are a lot of species where this model doesn't work. So you have to look at species that have low frequency variability. Okay, go ahead, Sina.
You think when we could we like use this also for like marine heat waves and their impact on ecosystems, but like when marine heat waves are more like 2 or 3 months long, like how would we need to like adjust this?
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to adjust it a lot, actually. You can use it like that, and it would be an interesting sort of experiment to do with some real data. I know for a fact that, for example, in the Gulf of Alaska, you know, some of the species have not yet recovered from these marine heat waves, and they have had this, you know, persistent stress. And so it would be interesting to see how much of these persistent changes can be simply explained by a memory versus how much of those are really driven by the fact that the marine heat wave has disrupted, you know, important ecosystem functions that have not recovered by themselves, period. I don't know if you follow what I'm saying. So are they going to recover, and is there just persistent in the state because it's just a bit of a memory, or are there been some profound transformation of the ecosystem where, you know, some species have disappeared, and who knows? But for sure, there's a lot of literature suggesting that you know, there's still ongoing sort of changes in the ecosystem that have not recovered, and people are trying to understand why.
Okay,
And if there's
thank
any
you.
ecological person in the room, please step in, because, you know, I'm not, you know, I am an ecologist wannabe kind of thing.
Well, Manu, I'm going to thank you for spending almost 3 hours of your time with us today. And yeah, this is amazing. So let's everybody give Manu another
I wish I
hand.
could have been there with you and do also some social. This has been really unfortunate, but thank you for staying with me. Have a great continuation and have fun, guys. Enjoy. The summer schools are the best. Love you. Bye.